I thought before we start, we could have a little geography quiz. You may all be, some of you, I think, probably aware of Byron's poem that starts, "The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold." Where's Assyria? Middle East, but that's good. Well, it's Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon. It's a big area. Then we have, well, the Cedars of Lebanon. We know where they are, but where's Babylonia? Now, it's Iraq, yeah, and Mesopotamia, same place, and Persia is. Okay, these are the countries that we've dealt with. So I'd like to move on to more modern, last time we did 2,000 years. Today last year time was 1,000, this time 2,000. But let's see what we can do. What we talked about, and we'll mention again, there's this heritage of King David, who's supposed to be, he's still got this image of the, this great king. After he died, his son Solomon took over, but after Solomon, the place split apart into Judea and Israel. And here is a map of the way according to the Bible, how the 12 tribes divided up the country, and here's the Jordan River. So this is important for the claims of some of the many of the Israeli nationalists that this whole area should be the state of Israel. Remember, this was right all around here. It's what's called the West Bank, that was conquered by Israel in 1967. And traditionally, they were over what is now Jordan. Here is a map that suggests Kingdom of Israel in the north, Kingdom of Judah in the south, surrounded by all these other kingdoms, many of which are conquered by David, and then we talked about the prophets, how being a prophet is a vocation. It's not just the few people that are in the Bible. There are many, many prophets. The most literary ones are the ones that have survived. Last week, for example, I said the book of Isaiah, 67 chapters, but now I know it's on 66. In case that bothered you. And Micah is 7 chapters, not 4. But anyway, you've heard of the 10 lost tribes. These are the 10 tribes up here in this northern area that were sent into exile when the Assyrians, whom we just mentioned, conquered the place. That was 722 BCE. That means the kingdom of Judah, and we have these reforms under King Josiah in the 620s, and we think that's where the book of Deuteronomy comes from. It really establishes the Jerusalem and the temple as the center, even though they've been agitating for that before, but this is really the establishment of it. But the temple was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. That's Iraq, where Iraq is. There's a partial return under the Persians, Ezra and Nehemiah. And the final, really, end of independence is 70 CE. That's the destruction of the Second Temple. Even though there's this revolt, I mentioned Bar Kokhba, the first, quote, president of Israel, if you will. They use that term, Nasi. So those are the things we talked about last week. And those dates especially 586 and 70, appear a lot when you read things about Jewish history. Well, what happened? And the course, as I mentioned, it's not a course about religion as such, not theology, but the interplay of religious forces and political forces. So after the first temple is destroyed and large numbers of people are deported to Babylonia, they sort of set up their own community in Babylonia. They did not become lost tribes the way that it happened earlier. They sort of stuck together. And then after 70, you have another wave of expulsions. But by then, the Jews, and use that term, Hebrews, Israelites, were spread all over the Mediterranean area. We know, for example, that Paul, as sort of the father of Christianity in a way, was a Roman citizen, and he was also originally Jewish. So, this is an indication of the spread of Jews all through the Mediterranean. Until the destruction of that temple, Jerusalem claimed leadership. And here's just a map mentioning those places that we did just a few minutes ago. Babylonia, Assyria covered all of this. Going way up here to the Hittites. Hittites were in Turkey. And right here, Ur, traditionally the home of Abraham in the Bible, came from Ur. In Babylonia, they had a person, we're not sure, we don't know too much about him. In English, he's called an exilarch. In Aramaic, he's called the Reish Garuta, the head of the diaspora. So he's some kind of political figure in this Jewish community in Babylonia. As I said, we don't know too much about him, and I know even less. The origins of this person are unclear. He claims to be descended from David. Remember, I said this is the big thing. Even today in the 21st century, there are groups who want to claim descent from King David. It's important. Of course, the Jews aren't the only ones who do that. If you look at Islam, descendants of Muhammad are very important. And we'll talk more about that next week. This little map on the right suggests, it gives you these names that you're probably unfamiliar with. Pumbedita, Nehardea, and Sura are Talmudical academies. You've heard of the Talmud. I'm not sure if you know what it is, but it's a development of Jewish law. This is where it was put together in those academies and developed, especially in Sura and Pumbedita. This is Iraq, or Babylonia, Iraq. Let's see. So you have this ongoing image of Jerusalem as a center. And let me move this out of the way. And there's this comment in the Talmud. That's what it says right here in Hebrew. We created lives for ourselves in Babylonia as we did in the land of Israel. That is to say, they've come to terms with the fact they're not in the land of Israel anymore. It's just a new life. And it's the center of the diaspora. For 1,000 years, that's the center of Jewish life in Babylonia until they're dispersed by Muslim conquest. Now, we have to move forward. There we go. That was the end of, except for Babylonia, you don't have any self-government in what we now call Palestine or Israel. Jerusalem remains a center. And if you think about consciousness, this is a center for Jews, for Christians, and later on, after the 7th century, for Muslims. This is what makes the city so contested, because of all the religions claiming this as a holy city. And of course, when you visit Jerusalem, you see there's this conflict among the various Christian groups too. Who claims what? There's a story that I may have mentioned this, that the Coptic church, which is the one in Egypt, also has a monastery in Jerusalem near one of the stations of the cross. But they didn't want all these other people coming around to bother their station of the cross, so they moved the sign. So they have their station of the cross, and about 100 yards away, there's another one where they got all the tourists go. So the question is, where's the real one? Yeah. There's also a question after 70 is, who is a Jew? There's this legacy of Abraham, and here you have this infamous, well-known, now infamous incident of Abraham banishing Hagar, who was his concubine, and Hagar is the mother of Ishmael. So that's the origin of, our Muslim tradition of the Ishmaelites, and this split between Jews and Muslims. And this thing doesn't want to cooperate. There we are. We have a legacy of the 12 tribes, even though 10 of them got lost. That's still part of the myth, let's call it the mythology. And I don't mean mythology in a negative sense, but all those traditions that fit together without necessarily historical evidence, but people believe in them. There's this legacy of the two kingdoms, and now we have the diaspora. This is among Jews, certainly something very famous. It's the Arch of Titus in Rome. After the destruction of the temple in 70, here's a symbol of the booty being taken by the Roman soldiers. That's this famous menorah candelabra right there. So it's still there when you go to Rome. And just I threw in some other symbols. This is a prayer box that's used by Orthodox Jews in daily prayer. You still have this question, are the Jews a religious group, an ethnic group, or a nationality? For a long time, until the 19th century, people didn't worry about those distinctions. But if you think about our society now, you really do have to look very hard at that and figure out just what it is you're talking about. In the 1950s, there was a well-known book in the United States called Catholic Protestant Jew, where he talks about three religious traditions in the United States, and totally misunderstands the notion of an ethnic group. So Jews are not parallel to Methodists, for example. It's a different kind of group. Jews are much more similar to Muslims, as we'll see, in that regard. And this is just a picture of various groups identifying as Jews. In this case, a religious group. And I just thought it was a nice picture to go in. In terms of beliefs, Gershom Scholem, who is a very well-known Jewish thinker, makes this comment that Judaism cannot be defined according to its essence, since it has no essence. And I think what he's saying is that theology is not very important. What's important are the actions of people. You go through rabbinic literature, and there are a lot of questions of whether people actually believe in God or not, but as long as they do the correct rituals and act accordingly, it doesn't matter. So I think that's what Scholem is getting at. And I think, in my mind, that's a big distinction between Judaism and Christianity. Judaism is a religion of law. And what becomes important is the rabbi. The main task of the rabbi was not, as it is today, to raise money, But to elucidate the law, so these are not associated with institutions, they are scholars. And this is just a picture, move this, in case you have never seen. This is a copy of the first page of the Babylonian Talmud. And it's an example of how long this thing has existed, because this column in the middle is the text that goes back, let's say, it's codified around the 6th century. Then you have commentary on this side to explain it, a different commentary here. And each of these little things here are commentaries over the centuries, and people keep adding to it. So this is what when you see these images of Jewish scholars, this is mainly what they're studying. And it's mainly in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. So my battery is running low. This shouldn't be the case. I hope there's not a problem. I might want to plug in my PC. I definitely want to plug it in. Oh, if all else fails, plug it in. Sorry about that. Hey, stop. All right, I'm supposed to be the one who knows about these things. And, the emperor has no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. We're going to skip ahead now because, as I said, Babylonia, you have this community which begins to dissolve because of Muslim control of the area. So they no longer have this religious freedom. And the Polish rabbinate becomes very important. There's a deep concern for personal salvation. In this sense, excuse me, in this sense, there's a little more theology. They have this penance for sins, but they're still writing. The way they write is to have commentaries on these texts. That's what I just showed you about the Talmud, all those commentaries. Well, that's what they're doing. And what happens is that Polish scholars come to the fore, and they are, for a while, they begin to prize asceticism, which is not great. But anyway, later on, you have two kinds of a rabbi. You have the town rabbi. This is by the 17th century, who gets a kind of a salary from the local community. And then he gets extra incomes, weddings, funerals, and so on. So that's not so different from the way rabbis make a living now, although they're paid by the congregation. Or you have the head of a yeshiva. Yeshiva is a college for advanced Jewish learning. And they still exist, of course. Israel's full of them, but so is New York and other places, New Jersey and all over. There is a mystical tradition that's shared by Christianity as well, something called the Zohar. We're not going to look at what the Zohar does. I'll leave that for Chava, some other cause. But it's there, it's an influence. And I mention these things because there's a kind of a self-government in exile. And they set up something called the Councils of the Four Lands, the Four Lands being different parts of Poland and what's now Ukraine. And they started meeting in approximately the late 16th century. And they decide on what are called religious questions, but they're not only religious. For example, what kind of food can you eat? Well, it's a religious comment, but it's also a comment on the structure of your community. And so it's a kind of a parliament of Polish Jewry. And I say the Council of the Principality of Lithuania. Remember that Poland and Lithuania combined in 1569. And here you have this map. These various green colors are Poland and Lithuania, and what's now Ukraine. This is a very large area. And that red, well, the red circle refers to a lot of problems in the 17th century. And then the arrows suggest where people start to emigrate from later. But in the 17th, 18th century, this is where large numbers of the Jews lived. And on these councils, there are relations among communities, not so much as individuals. And let's see if I have the next slide. I have some pictures to show you. But anyway, a lot of the Jews become what are called tax farmers. A tax farmer is someone who negotiates with a landowner or a government to collect taxes. And then he skins off a bit of it. That's how that person makes a living. Well, in Ukraine, you have Polish landowners, Ukrainian peasants, and Jewish tax farmers. And it really feeds into enormous resentment by the population, by the Ukrainians, by the Ukrainian population against the Jewish and Polish landowners and tax farmers. So the tax farmers take the brunt, a lot of the brunt of the anger, and this is combined with more traditional anti-Semitism based in Christianity. But this really is a difficult period, since this is where the majority of the Jews live and where you get very serious evidence of anti-Semitism. There we are. The councils were always deeply in debt. And who did they owe money to? Very often to the churches. So the churches were interested in keeping these councils together because they wanted to collect what was owed to them. Very commonly, the protectors of the Jews tend to be the churches, the organized church. They're tied together for economic and social reasons. Well, once again, you have the notion of the Jews in Central Europe as a nationality or a religious group, and that comes about in the 19th century when other national groups start getting consciousness. For example, the Serbs and the Croats didn't know they were Serbs and Croats till the 19th century, or the Slovaks emerged, or the Czechs that had been repressed in the 17th century all of a sudden re-emerged, and the Ukrainians. So the Jews are in this area where all these groups are emerging. And this kind of self-government in these councils were ending by the middle of the 18th century, because now governments wanted to control the taxation themselves and to control the community themselves, especially after the partitions of Poland. Many of you have probably heard of the partitions of Poland, some not. What happened in the 18th century is that Russia, Prussia, and Austria decided to annex parts of Poland. Essentially, that's what happened. And by 1794, Poland, which in the 17th century was perhaps the largest country in Europe, disappeared. It didn't exist from 1794 to 1918. And in its place, the Russians set up something called this Pale of Settlement. See if we can get a map here. See, these green things are the parts of Poland annexed by Russia. And the blue things are the parts of Poland annexed by Prussia. And the yellow and orange are the areas annexed by Austria-Hungary. And the differences made a lot of difference for the people who live there. So, for example, Galicia, which is now a part of Ukraine, was in Austria-Hungary. And the Jews in Galicia developed a very strong loyalty to the Austrian Empire. I mean, it's not as though they were living the life of royalty, if you will, but they were doing a lot better than, say, the Jews in Russia, who hated the Tsar because of the repressions against the Jews in that area. So you get gradually this old self-government is disappearing. But until we get modern communication and transportation, these local communities are still important, and we'll see in a minute. This is what's called the Pale of Settlement. Pale is, I don't know why we use that word. It's probably the only time we ever use it for a district, P-A-L-E. And it's this area here. This, where I'm circling with the mouse, is what's here. And it's what would be today Poland and Western Ukraine without Galicia. And then it becomes important. So the councils, while they existed, get involved in politics because there's competition for Jews. For example, some different people want to be tax farmers. It could be a lucrative profession. And the councils get involved. I was interested in this. This is a little town called Pinchów, which is where at times the councils of the Four Lands met, and they have inscriptions with names of donors. If you're familiar with with synagogues and with other ethnic groups, they got donors all over the place who helped them move along. And here's one. I'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, on the bottom, I was in Pinchów. That's graffiti. The people who came to the meetings carved their names in the wall. I was very much amused by that. Here you have, relating to the tax farmers, where it says in 1602, hard labor is prohibited, but a Jew shall release the village Gentiles from work they have to on Sabbaths and festivals. That is to say, Jews are employers. They are administering these societies for the government. And these councils of the Four Lands are kind of a mini government until they get dissolved in the 18th century. There's a new kind of challenge to the traditional life, and that's Hasidism. You may have heard the term. And in the 18th century, you have faith healers all over Europe who are emerging. And the most famous Jewish one is named the Baal Shem Tov. This is what we think he looked like, and this is what he emphasizes, that you guys, you rabbis, are too intent on legalistic interpretations. Instead, the relationship to God and with each other has to be a relationship of joy. And when you pray, it can't be mechanical. It has to be with intent and with joy at the same time. And there is, I guess it's not exactly a schism, but it was very close to dividing Jews very significantly. Here's his tomb. What happened after he died in 1760, as with other movements, there are some of his followers who organized a movement. And this Hasidism is not simply a theological challenge. That's the big thing I want to emphasize. It's a challenge to the elite. No longer are the learned rabbis the guys in charge, but instead you have these local leaders who develop into something called the tzaddik. The tzaddik is the word means a righteous man, but in this sense, it's a local leader who has his followers, and they develop dynasties which exist to today, to 2023. They're still around. Now in Poland, I've seen a map, there are at least 130 different dynasties of different sizes, and we'll see some evidence of how they still exist. But the point is that all of a sudden, the traditional rabbis are no longer in charge in these communities. And this is particularly in Ukraine, partially in Galicia. You have lots of maps that say here the Hasidim are in charge, here the traditional rabbinic Judaism is in charge. And it really changes the whole local government. So there's a battle for control. It's interesting that in the 1750s, the rabbinic authorities appealed to the Roman Catholic Church to help them get rid of what is considered a heresy. I'm not going to talk about that heresy. It's sort of interesting. But after that, you have conflicts between the Hasidim and what's called the rabbinic tradition. So, for example, one of the leading Hasidic rabbis goes to jail because he's denounced by the traditional rabbinists. And interesting, this one is called the Lubavitcher rabbi, perhaps the most famous of all of them. But these things happen. Anyway, here's this phenomenon that tzaddik, who is kind of a supreme overlord of a small group. And I just have some pictures here. This is an old portrait. You know, there's this biblical injunction against shaving, certainly using a blade. If you're worried, you can buy an electric razor, it's okay. But this is the 21st century. They're still dressed the way, that's a tradition we think comes from the 18th century. Now, these are little kids who are being brought into that community very early on. And I don't know whether that's in New York or in Israel. But this is just an example, not an example, a table of where these people, where these Hasidim live. If you look at just the first 2 or 3 lines, it says in Israel, there are about 62,000 Hasidic families. And in the United States, there are about 53,000. Now you should know, they put a premium on a number of children. Families of 5 and 6 children are not uncommon. So they are 62,000 people. Households, in that case, could be as many as 300,000 people or so. And if you look on the far right, where it says dominant group, and it says Ger, G-E-R, that's a Hasidic dynasty. Ger is the dynasty from Warsaw area. And then just below that, it says Sotmar. Sotmar is the one from Hungary, and it's the dominant one in the United States. I'm going to show you a few more pictures of the Sotmar, that they are enclosed communities, that politically they dominate their followers. So here's the Sotmar Rebbe, and I think this is going to be a wedding. I'm going to show a short clip. I have to fix this for a minute so that people at home can hear, so they can get the sound. Okay. Now we're going to go back to where we were, I think. Yeah. This is a mitzvah dance. And I just want you to look at the audience in addition to what you see here. They're all, lots of them, they're all dressed the same. And if you notice in the front row, there are little kids that dressed exactly like their adults. And it's all men. There are no women in this audience. And the man in white, you'll see is the Rebbe, the Tzaddik. Here he comes, he's leading the group. This is this notion of joy in celebrations. Now this, which I'm going to play the whole thing. This goes on for 10 minutes. And later he picks his favorites and he dances with individuals. Right. Not letting me go to the next slide. Come on, please. Okay. Well, most of these Jews live in Russia, except for Galicia. So I'm switching over for a moment to how the Russian government deals with this kind of competition for internal political control. And you have this man named Konstantin Pobyedonostiv, practice the pronunciation at home, who's called the procurator of the most holy synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. In the late 19th century, he formulates, or he doesn't formulate, but he follows through this formula: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. Orthodoxy is Russian Orthodox, autocracy is the Tsar, and nationality means Russians. So you get, here's this Pobyedonostiv, a portrait by a famous Russian artist. And he says, a third of the Jews should die off, a third move out, and a third dissolve into the surrounding population. Well, lots of them moved out. As you know, this is the period of this very heavy immigration to Western Europe and the United States. Or if you think of, well, in the movie Fiddle on the Roof, it shows these people leaving the villages at the end of the, let's say, 1880s. And I guess here's a drawing of what one artist thought of a Jewish couple from the Pale of Settlement. The woman looks a lot more modern than the man does. But anyway, that goes back to the 18th century. Following up on this, here you have the 1890s that trying to get rid of the Jews. In the 1920s and 30s, I'm convinced by my reading that anti-Semitism is not an official Russian policy in the 1920s. Begins to change in the 1930s. But in the 1920s, they still want to change the society. And here you have an example of a poster. I'm trying to get this out of the way. And it says it in Yiddish and in Russian. With every turn of the tractor tire, the Jewish peasants build socialism. Help. That is to say, you're trying to change the character of the society, where the worker and the peasant are considered the heroes of the new Soviet regime. And I had never seen that poster before, and I'm fascinated by it. This okay. You have a new challenge to religion in the second half of the 19th century. And that's Zionism. And that, of course, is going to lead us into political struggles down to today. You have the Jewish community is divided into the Orthodox, who are subdivided into the Hasidim and the rabbinic groups, whom I mentioned. They're challenged by what's called the Jewish Enlightenment, which is a more highly educated, wants to acculturate, and in fact, that push from the Enlightened is what pushes the rabbinic and the Hasidim together. You know, they're not great friends, but they're no longer enemies in the same way because they have a common enemy, these so-called, what they call German Jews. And you get in the late 19th and early 20th century, the rise of Zionists, who also are competing for the support of these different parts of the population. Here's an example of a man who lived all through the 19th century, the Chofetz Chaim. He's what happens is these rabbis are known by the titles of their books. So he wrote a book in which he absolutely refuses to acknowledge anything that's modern. No change is admissible for him. I'm particularly taken by this because when I was a kid, my parents sent me to a Jewish parochial school called Chofetz Chaim. We had no idea who that was, but it's only in the past few years I've learned it. He is about as reactionary as you can get. Any change is bad. And here you have a cartoon where the Russian government is using the Jewish community against itself. So they hire a chassid to become a censor. And since they can't read what the guys are writing, because they're writing mainly in Hebrew, although later on, it's a test of how acculturated they get because you get some people starting to write in Russian or German. But anyway, it's this constant struggle that was originally political, now it's cultural. Yeah. So the Jewish Enlightenment, they advocated acculturation, but it still says they're interested in the Jewish community as a distinct society. They're taking over some of the values of the general public, but they don't want to convert to Christianity in the East. In Germany, conversions to Christianity become very common because that's the way you acculturate some of you. For example, Felix Mendelssohn, the composer, is the grandson or great-grandson of the man who's considered the most famous enlightened thinker of the Jewish Enlightenment. The whole family moved over. Very often what you have is one son converts and becomes a professor, and the other son stays Jewish and runs the family business. Well, 1897 is the first Zionist Congress, and it's not met with a universal acclaim. I mean, this is small potatoes initially, but it's the origin of what we're seeing today. So in the interwar period, I'm really moving over a lot of years fast. I'm not going to deal with World War I, which is a whole topic in itself and how the Jews fared. They had a lot of trouble after the end of World War I. Pogroms became very widespread just in those areas where the tax farmers had been common. But anyway, after World War I, here's this map of what I say, Lithuania versus Poland. What I want to show you is Lithuania and Poland here, where large numbers of Jews. There's something called minority rights. And the treaties of Versailles and other treaties ending the First World War said that all these new countries that hadn't existed before, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, here's the whole list there. They hadn't been countries by themselves. Turkey had been an Ottoman Empire, but it's a different country now. They all are supposed to guarantee equal rights for racial, religious, or linguistic minorities. Now, as you might expect, they all ignored that. So in part because they're saying, who are you to tell us how to run our country? Political item. I mean, you can think about it. If someone says, well, the United States, for example, the United States does not subscribe to the International Court of Justice, as we're saying, who are you to tell us how our legal system should run? This is the same thing in the 1920s and 30s. The Jews in particular are involved because they have some very good spokesmen, and they called for the Jewish minority in Lithuania, which was, again, this small area here in around here. Vilna, by the way, was in Poland, not in Lithuania. What they said, this is going backwards, they said they want their own cultural and social institutions. They wanted full rights for Jews as citizens, and they wanted autonomy to establish their local these councils. And there were some in the first few years. You know, they dealt with all these family matters, births, deaths, marriages, divorces, so on. But once again, the community is split apart. Zionist, bourgeois Lithuanian, as they call themselves, and the religious groups. Here's a picture of Vilna, which is known in Jewish tradition as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. It's really a culture in the 1920s, the Jewish intellectual center. I'm going to move fast because I'd like to say something about what's happening in Israel. This idea of self-rule. The Nazis come in and they conquer, starting in 1939, they conquer this whole large area, Poland, much of Ukraine, and they set up, before they start, in some areas, before they're killing people, they set up what they call Jewish councils. Supposedly, the Jews are to run themselves. Actually, they are seen as messengers for the Nazis. So here's a Judenrat is the word, is one group. Here's one in the city of Lvov, which is where this infamous so-called dictator of the Łódź ghetto. But what's interesting here, for our purposes, is Hannah Arendt, a famous scholar, writes a book called The Banality of Evil. You may have heard of it. She wrote this book in the early 1960s as a result of her watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann, if you recall, was kidnapped in Argentina by Israelis and put on trial for his part in the Holocaust. Hannah Arendt wrote this book where she says the Nazis never could have done it without the cooperation of these Jewish councils. This is aside from the banality of evil argument. This is a different argument. And as you can imagine, the Jewish community went crazy over this. And for all the evidence against her, she never relented. She had been, still as a leading scholar, but completely cut herself off from almost everybody whom she knew with this, as far as I'm concerned, a ridiculous argument. Although hard to say someone as smart as she is says ridiculous things, but she was very stubborn. She didn't move in her opinions despite evidence to the contrary. I just thought you should be aware of that. She is also known for this term, the banality of evil, that Eichmann is a very banal person. That's a different issue. That's an argument much more easily defended than this one. There's a picture of Eichmann at the trial. I was at the trial in 1961 as a spectator. It was gruesome. Well, continuing this topic of politics and religion. You know, we're not doing a history course in this regular sense, but the state of Israel continues to have the debate over what role religion plays. This picture, I think, is a good example of this kind of conflict of what's going on. Up until the creation of the state of Israel, religious groups in the main rejected Zionists. There's some exceptions, but in the main they say we need to wait for the Messiah. And what individuals are doing is not acceptable. In 1948, Israel declares independence, and a deal is struck between Mapai, which is the dominant political party led by David Ben-Gurion, and the religious community that says the chief rabbinate will have control over kosher food, over activity or lack thereof on the Sabbath, on Jewish burial and personal status like marriage and divorce, that the streets in the very ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods will be closed to traffic on the Sabbath, no public transport, for whatever reason, Haifa was exempted. And the chief rabbinate has a lot of control over restaurants. This still exists. So if there's some political argument now in Israel, the rabbinate will threaten to take away the certification of being kosher, even though it's got nothing to do with the food, but it's a question of control. So here's where you have the religion and the politics being conflated. And then in 1977, the right wing takes over for the first time, and one big concession is exemptions from military service. So in 1948, there were 400 exemptions for the Orthodox students. In 2022, there are approximately 50,000 exemptions. So it's a real point of anger in the community. Now remember, this is the ultra-Orthodox. The guys with the earmarks and the black coats and the hats and so on. Hear what they say. There's a sign that says, military service will not be imposed upon us, is their argument. Never had, no. I want to mention one political and religious party. In Yiddish, it was called Agudas Israel. In Hebrew, it's Agudat Israel, as the pronunciation is changed. It originated as a Jewish political party in Poland in 1912. That these guys were not acculturated in language, but they became acculturated in politics. They became a potent pressure group in the Jewish community. You know, they want to control whatever control is left. And even when they were in Palestine, they opposed the Zionists. So here's just a picture of the World Agudas Israel World Executive Committee. It's a mixture of Orthodox men. It is men. And in 1948, in Israel, they enter politics. They're so political that by 1980 they can split. You know, this often happens when you have radicals, and so there is another tradition of Jews from the North African and Turkish areas, this Sephardim, and the non-Hasidic Orthodox split. So you have my point is it's not as though it's a unitary kind of thing. The Aguda still exists in Israel and in New York and elsewhere. But what they all want is funding for the yeshivas and community institutions. They want exemption of yeshiva students from the army. And they want legislation to observe the Sabbath and kosher food. Finally, the Satmar Hasid, the one we saw the picture of, today reject the existence of Israel as an appropriate state. They're still waiting for the Messiah. But they're very prolific, lots of children. Oops, I have to come back to women next week. But let's go to the Satmar, because the time is running out. Whoops. The Satmar are in New York. If you see pictures of Hasidim, mainly they're from New York, and they're very clever at manipulating the government. For example, they receive huge amounts of funds from the New York State government for their schools, and their schools are totally out of control because of what they teach or don't teach. A lot of them have moved to suburban communities and taken over the town councils. So it's not a pleasant kind of experience. And they are very much involved in this. Who is a Jew? They want to control that in Israel. They have all these Russian immigrants, and they don't want to accept lots of those Russian immigrants because they don't fit in, you see, as the traditional definition of who is a Jew. This is sort of a more liberal notion that they're all over the place. Last slide. We think there are about 9.4 million people in Israel today, of whom 73% are Jewish. Remember, that's an ethnic category, not a religious category. And 18% Muslim, that's more of a religious category. And here you have, it says 1.4 million Israeli Muslims speak Arabic, one of the official languages of Israel. Well, there's this drive by the right wing. Arabic is no longer an official language since 2018. And that means something for what language you can use in court and on documents. The Jews themselves are divided up into secular, traditional, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. And here's an example of the ultra-Orthodox. For example, they're not allowed to watch television or buy newspapers. So they get their information from wall placards. These are posters that go up. And here's one that says, this was in 1991 when Iraq was sending missiles against Israel at the time of the Kuwait War. In time of troubles and evil decrees, be warned that you should repent immediately. Psalms versus missiles. God will fight for you and you should remain silent. There is another issue going on, and probably I should mention this next week. It's really important. Two things. There are messianic trends within Judaism. So this rabbi who just died recently was considered, Mashiach is this Hebrew and Yiddish term for Messiah. He died, and a lot of his followers say he was the Messiah. I don't know what that means in terms of society. It hasn't changed. But anyway, that's Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. It's a big issue. And I mentioned the Satmar movement, that they're corrupt. I don't think any argument about that. The last thing I want to say, West Bank settlers. This is another kind of messianic movement among Jews. If you look at them, they're not dressed in the black coats and hats. These are guys with earlocks and carrying submachine guns. And the West Bank, I mean, we know there's a war in Gaza. The West Bank is the next setting for something that's going to happen. I mean, after 1967, settlers started moving in. And I think when we talk about Islam next week, we can go back to that to say, what does this mean for the conflict in the West Bank? But it is time to end. I'm sorry for running over, but I don't know if I can say for a few minutes if someone has questions or comments, maybe we should do that afterwards because we do have to stop, but I'll be glad to talk to anybody who has any other comments. But anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you. Okay, the same thing, people at home, we'll have to talk privately because it is after 12 o'clock. So.